The hand moves before the laptop screen, even wakes up. No hosetaschen, no ceremony. The patch comes out of a small cardboard sleeve, the kind you'd keep in a jacket pocket next to a tube of lip balm, and he presses it against the inside of his forearm the way you'd smooth a plaster over a minor cut. Efficient, already thinking about something else. The blue light catches the edge of it, translucent and almost invisible against his skin. 6:03 in the morning. Cold coffee on the left side of the desk. Somewhere outside, a sprinkler is running in the dark, ticking through its cycle. You watch this, and your brain does something interesting. It reaches for a category, tries to place what it's seeing, and it keeps missing, because what you're watching doesn't fit the taxonomy of habit. It doesn't fit the parking lot behind the building, the cupped flame against the wind, the exhale that carries something complicated and half-ashamed. This man isn't hiding anything. He isn't relieving anything. He's not reaching for comfort. He's installing a condition. The way a swimmer pulls on goggles before the block. The way a surgeon adjusts the overhead light before the first incision. Pre-performance. Deliberate. Already somewhere ahead of the moment. That's when the question arrives. Not as alarm, but as genuine disorientation. When did this happen? Not when did nicotine become a tool that certain people talk about in certain rooms. That conversation has been running quietly for years, in forums and transcripts and podcast episodes that start with a number and end with an ad for a cold plunge. What changed is something more specific. The conversation went loud. It crossed into mainstream coverage in the last 18 months, and it landed in the laps of people exactly like that man at the desk. Professionals in their late 40s, their 50s, carrying real cognitive loads, real stakes, and a quiet, persistent awareness that the brain they're running now is not the brain they were running 15 years ago. Slower on recovery, harder to shift into gear. The mornings take longer. The attention economy noticed. The supplement industry noticed. And now the argument is everywhere, but it keeps stopping in the wrong place. The debate you'll find in the coverage is almost entirely about the molecule. Receptor binding, half-life, the separability of nicotine from tobacco combustion, risk profile in patch or lozenge or gum. That debate is real and we'll move through it with precision. The research is more nuanced than either side is reporting, and there are specific numbers worth knowing. But underneath the molecule is a layer the coverage keeps walking past. You can feel it in the data, in the way the results fracture. Same compound, same dose, same protocol, same timing. Two people. Outcomes so divergent they sound like they're describing different substances entirely. One man sitting at a desk at 6 in the morning, moving through work with a quality of focus that feels almost architectural, and another man reporting headaches and irritability and nothing he'd call benefit. Same patch, same arm, completely different interior. That interior, the dopaminergic architecture of a brain in chronic low-grade tension, the kind that accumulates silently over compressed years, over a body that stopped being asked what it needed. That brain is running on different rails than a brain in a different state. Not a different life, not a different protocol, a different condition. And that difference is not soft data. It shows up in imaging. It shows up in how receptor sites respond to the same molecule arriving at the same concentration, which is why the man at the desk matters. The patch on his arm, the cold coffee, the sprinkler finishing its last arc outside in the dark. Someone changed how he understood what he was targeting. And that change in understanding altered the condition he brought to the compound. Not as mysticism, as mechanism. That's the argument this series is making. And by the end of it, the molecule will look like the least interesting part of the story. My father smoked Winston's. He quit in 1987, the year his older brother went in for the biopsy, and I do not think he ever stopped feeling like he had escaped something that should have caught him. That is where I start when I try to understand my own reaction to this topic. Not with a definition, not with a disclaimer, but with a specific man standing in the driveway at night, hands doing nothing, the habit gone and the hands still looking for it. If you're in your late 40s or 50s, you have a version of that driveway. Maybe it is a specific chair, a particular person's way of disappearing into a back room. The sound of coughing that changed quality over months until it wasn't something you could pretend not to hear. You carried that into adulthood, and it became reflex. The word nicotine lands in the body before the mind has a chance to examine it. That reflex is the subject of this chapter, not nicotine itself. Because there is no honest version of this conversation that doesn't begin here. We were not merely informed. We were conditioned systematically over years through school assemblies and warning labels and television spots that were never really designed to educate. They were designed to imprint, and they worked. They worked so thoroughly that for most of our generation, the aversion is no longer separable from instinct. It operates beneath reasoning. The alarm trips before you've read the sentence. That is not a flaw in you. It is the predictable result of consistent, decades-long negative association installed during formative years. The brain files repeated external messaging in the same architecture as lived experience. Both arrive in the body as fact. And so the grief, the campaigns, the cultural memory of what cigarettes did to the people we loved, all of it got written into the same layer. Not stored separately as history, filed as warning. What I want to say plainly is this: that warning is legitimate. The people you buried were real. The grief was real. Nothing in this video touches that. But there is a difference between a warning that was earned and a warning that was installed. And for most of us, what we carry is a mixture of both, and we have never had to sort out which is which because no one ever asked us to. No one ever gave us a reason to. Here is where the chapter turns. The researchers and podcasters currently driving the conversation about nicotine as a cognitive tool tend to be in their 30s, sometimes younger. They present the pharmacology cleanly, without static, because for them the word does not arrive preloaded. It is just a molecule. They're not wrong about the molecule, but they are speaking past the specific person sitting here. The one for whom this topic still carries a face, a room, a year. And yet somehow, this generation is moving into this practice anyway. Not the reckless ones. Not the ones who missed the campaigns or buried no one. The careful ones. The ones who read everything. Who switched to olive oil and walked 10,000 steps and threw out the processed food. They are the most health-conscious, middle-aged cohort in American history. And a growing number of them are putting nicotine into their mornings deliberately. That inversion is what this video is actually about. Not whether the pharmacology is defensible. There will be time for that. But what it takes to move through a fear this old and this legitimate. What force is sufficient to lift a conditioned response that was installed at the level of grief? Because it is not information. Information does not reach that layer. People know the difference between a Winston and a patch, and still feel the same alarm, because the alarm was never really about the delivery mechanism. It was about the word, the association, the record of loss embedded in 3 syllables. Something else is operating in the people who have made the crossing. Some shift in how they're holding the old fear alongside new information, not overriding it, not performing indifference they don't feel, but doing something more difficult, carrying both at once without letting either cancel the other. That is the move this conversation is going to ask you to consider. Not a conclusion, a posture, and whether you can stay in it long enough to hear what comes next without the alarm deciding for you first. There is a cultural moment when a thing crosses from one world into another, and the crossing is never clean. Somewhere around 2019, a handful of men in their late 30s, engineers mostly, a few founders, 1 or 2 surgeons who should have known better than to run unsupervised experiments on themselves, began wearing nicotine patches on their upper arms during morning work sessions. Not the full cessation dose, a fraction of it. A 2 milligram patch, sometimes a 4, cut into quarters with a box cutter and applied to skin still warm from the shower. They were not trying to quit anything. They had never smoked. That was the point. The question that hung over the first 2 chapters of this conversation. What cultural earthquake moved nicotine from funeral eulogy to CEO protocol? Has a partial answer, and it does not begin where most people expect it to begin. It does not begin in a laboratory. It begins in a community forum at 2 in the afternoon, in the kind of thread where men who have optimized their sleep, their VO2 max, and their blood work eventually run out of low-hanging fruit and start looking at the ceiling. The ceiling, it turned out, was cognition. And somewhere in the search for an edge, someone remembered a cluster of older studies, papers from the late 90s and early 2000s that had been mostly filed away under tobacco research, and therefore rarely revisited by anyone who was not already inside that industry. Those papers had found something uncomfortable. That nicotine, isolated from combustion, delivered transdermally or sublingually, had measurable effects on sustained attention, working memory consolidation, and what researchers at Vanderbilt called temporal task switching, the ability to hold 2 competing threads of thought and move between them without losing either. A 2004 study published in Psychopharmacology found that non-smokers given low-dose nicotine patches showed statistically significant improvement on a battery of attention and short-term memory tasks compared to placebo. The effect was modest. The researchers were careful. But in the world of biohacking forums, modest and peer-reviewed is treated like a green light. By 2021, the conversation had moved above ground. National Review ran a piece, careful, hedged, but published, about cognitive enhancers gaining traction in professional circles. The Daily Wire picked up a thread about Silicon Valley's chemical productivity habits. Conservative media, which had spent a decade covering the opioid crisis with appropriate alarm, was now producing content that approached nicotine supplementation with something closer to curious neutrality. The framing was consistent. This is what high performers are doing. Here is what the science says. Here is what the risks might be. The tone was not advocacy, but it was not condemnation either. And then the numbers started circulating openly. The protocols these men were using, always men, in the early documentation, looked something like this. A 2 milligram nicotine patch applied 30 minutes before a 2 to 4 hour focused work block, removed immediately after, with a minimum of 2 to 3 patch-free days per week to prevent receptor downregulation. Some are using nicotine gum at 1 milligram, split into 2 doses. A few were experimenting with nicotine lozenges timed around creative problem-solving windows. The underlying logic was always the same: acute nicotinic acetylcholine receptor stimulation, primarily at the alpha 4 beta 2 subtype, produces a transient increase in prefrontal cortical activation and tightens the gain on the brain's attentional filter. Those forum threads had a particular texture, compressed, slightly overheated, the feeling of men who believed they were standing at the edge of something real. The air in the room where that work happened: machine oil from a standing desk cable management, eucalyptus from a diffuser someone had read improved oxygen saturation, the tight ozone smell of a laptop running hot. The patch on the arm. The timer set for 90 minutes. The window, if there was one, probably ignored. And here is where this chapter needs to stop and hold something without resolving it. The word nicotine does not arrive in most people over 45 as a neutral data point. It arrives carrying weight. It arrives with a specific visual: a reclining hospital bed cranked to 45 degrees. The sound a particular kind of cough makes at 3 in the morning when everyone else in the house is pretending to be asleep. The antiseptic smell of a room where someone spent months being slowly made smaller. Old upholstery. A coat that still held the smoke of someone who is no longer there to wear it. For a significant portion of the audience now being told that nicotine patches are cognitive protocol used by CEOs, the molecule is not abstract. It is attached to a face, to a funeral, to a grief that does not organize itself around the distinction between delivery mechanism and compound, a distinction the science insists upon and which grief, reliably, does not care about. That dissonance is not a side note. It is the central fact of this story. The biohacking community has been largely insulated from that weight. The average age in those early adopter forums was mid to late 30s. The relationship most of those men had with nicotine was intellectual. They had never watched it work on someone they loved. They had never associated the molecule with anything other than data. The conservative media coverage, to its credit, acknowledged the history more than the forums did. National Review mentioned addiction potential in the same sentence as cognitive benefit. But the framing was still, at its core, the framing of a supplement conversation: risk and reward, dose and outcome, individual choice and individual body. The grief sitting inside the history of that molecule was not part of the analysis. So we are left with this: the same compound that sits at the center of one of the longest-running public health catastrophes in American history, a catastrophe that still kills approximately 480,000 people in this country every year, most of them through the delivery mechanism, not the molecule itself. That same compound is now appearing in the morning routines of executives who are measuring their reaction time with apps and logging their focus scores in spreadsheets. The two things are both true at the same time. They do not cancel each other out. And any attempt to force a resolution right now would require choosing which truth to make smaller, which is a choice this chapter is not going to make. What the molecule does, isolated, delivered carefully, in doses a fraction of what a cigarette delivers. That is one thing. What the molecule means, carried inside the body of someone who lost a parent to it, who associates the word not with a patch and a productivity timer, but with a specific room and a specific smell. That is another thing entirely. The person who brings both of those into the same morning protocol is not managing a supplement. They are managing something older and heavier than that. And the energy they bring to that decision, the emotional frequency underneath it, whether it is clean curiosity or something that has grief wound through it, is not separate from the outcome. It is part of what determines it. That is not a soft observation. It is a precise one. The internal state a person carries into a physiological intervention shapes the terrain the intervention lands on. The same compound, in two different bodies running two different emotional baselines, is not producing identical effects, regardless of what the patch says on the label. That is the layer the biohacking forums are not measuring. And it is the layer that determines, more than the dosing protocol, whether what happens next is expansion or just a louder version of what was already running. There's a moment, somewhere around the 48th year of a human life, when the brain begins negotiating differently with itself. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. The way a river adjusts its current around a stone that was not there the season before, quietly, without announcement, redistributing pressure across a system that used to move without thinking about it. That redistribution is where this chapter enters. Not with the cultural argument about nicotine, not the risk calculus, the mechanism, the actual molecular event. Because without that, what comes after it has no foundation. Here it is. A cup of coffee goes cold on a desk. A paragraph gets read twice. A name arrives 2 seconds late. These are not signs of failure. They're the system reporting on itself. Honestly, the way any system does when capacity contracts. The question worth sitting with is not whether that is happening. The question is why. Deep inside the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for holding a thought long enough to do something useful with it, for filtering distraction, for the particular kind of focus that lets you stay in a problem instead of sliding off it. There are receptors. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. They're named for nicotine, but nicotine did not build them. Acetylcholine did. The brain built them for acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter your body has been producing since before you learned to walk, and they have been quietly running background operations on your cognition for decades. Nicotine simply fits the keyhole, imperfectly, bluntly, with more force than the key that was meant to turn it, but it fits. And that is why the sharpening feels real, because it is activating something real, something already there, something that has always been there. The cholinergic system is one of the oldest systems in the mammalian brain. It governs attention, not attention in the motivational sense, not willpower or discipline, but the raw biological capacity to direct neural resources toward a signal and hold them there. Working memory, processing speed, the ability to encode a new piece of information while simultaneously retaining the one you just received. Acetylcholine is the courier that makes that possible. When it is flowing in adequate supply, cognition handles complexity with a certain ease that is easy to take for granted. When it is not, the effort is real even when the task looks the same from the outside. The faint smell of cedar drifting through a cracked window, sun warm and particular to some earlier decade. The brain catches that without deciding to, files it, moves on. Where it used to. Whether it still does at the same resolution depends on what is happening inside the system processing it. Research from the Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm, work that sits well outside the noise of trend-driven wellness publishing, has documented the structural changes in nicotinic receptor density in the prefrontal cortex across the adult lifespan. The picture that emerges is not alarming in the sudden disaster sense. It is subtler, and because of that subtlety, easier to miss. Receptor density begins a measurable decline in the fourth decade of life. The neurons are still there. The architecture is largely intact, but the binding sites, the molecular landing pads for acetylcholine, are fewer. The signal requires more raw material to produce the same cognitive result. The lamp still works. The wattage has dropped. This is independent of whether someone has ever touched a cigarette. It is independent of diet, of exercise, of every protocol discussed in wellness culture with increasing urgency. It is a feature of the aging cholinergic system, not a bug introduced by behavior. Gary Aston Jones, whose laboratory at the Brain Health Institute has spent years mapping neuromodulatory systems and their role in cognitive function, has contributed to a body of research demonstrating that nicotinic receptor activity in the prefrontal cortex is not peripheral to cognition. It is load-bearing. The receptors he and his colleagues have been characterizing are part of the signaling infrastructure that determines how cleanly the prefrontal cortex communicates with deeper structures involved in memory consolidation and executive function. When that infrastructure is dense and responsive, complexity is manageable. When it is diminished, the cognitive load of ordinary tasks quietly increases, and nothing on the surface indicates why. What the nicotine patch research is really measuring, then, what the biohacking community is actually responding to when someone in their 50s reports that a 2 milligram dose clarified a morning that had been murky, is not a pharmacological miracle. It is a receptor system that already existed, already had a purpose, and is now receiving a signal closer to what it was calibrated to expect. The clarity was not imported. It was restored briefly to something the brain already knew. That is a different framing than the one usually offered. And the difference is not semantic, because here is what that framing makes possible. If the nicotinic system is a system you were born with, if it has architecture, if its function is dependent on inputs that can be varied, then the question is not only whether nicotine patches belong in a protocol. The question becomes, what is this system's baseline health, and what governs it? The cholinergic projections that innervate the prefrontal cortex originate largely in a structure called the nucleus basalis of Maynard. Degeneration, there is one of the earliest and most consistent findings in age-related cognitive decline, and it precedes measurable memory loss by years. It is not the whole story of that decline, but it is a chapter that appears reliably across populations, across studies, across decades of converging neurological evidence. The neurons in that structure are among the most metabolically demanding in the brain. They are sensitive to the internal chemical environment in which they operate, not just to what is eaten, not just to how much a person sleeps, but to the chronic emotional and physiological state that surrounds them, the persistent background signal the nervous system is running beneath everything else. Which is where this stops being purely a neuroscience discussion. Because how the body interprets its own environment, whether that environment registers as safe or as a slow-burning emergency is not just a psychological variable. It is a biological one. It shapes the chemical context in which those metabolically expensive neurons are either maintained or quietly left to decline. The bark of an old oak pressed against a palm, slightly damp, the mark it leaves, the brain registers that as texture, as presence, as now. The degree to which it still does that reliably is a measure of something real. And what governs that measure reaches further than any patch. There are two principles that appear once you begin looking at the system this way, not as side notes, but as structural features of how biological systems respond to their own internal states. The law of vibration and the law of attraction, understood not as metaphysics, but as functional descriptions of how chronic internal states, the frequency at which a nervous system is habitually operating, shape the physiological environment those neurons live in. These are not decorative concepts borrowed from self-help. They describe, in a different register, something the neuroscience is also describing, that what the system expects, what it has been conditioned to anticipate, changes what it is capable of. That is where the conversation opens in a territory that is less well-publicized than the patch debate and considerably more consequential. Whether what the Karolinska data says is already in motion can be slowed, not by the supplement, not by the patch, but by something operating at the level of the system's own biological context, is a question this chapter has been building toward and will not fully resolve here. It belongs to what comes next, and it will need the space. You are 53 years old, and you are standing in front of a mirror, and something is different. Not dramatically different. You reach for the word different, and it arrives a half-second late. And you notice that it arrived late, and then you spend the rest of the morning not quite thinking about it. That gap, that small, private, half-second gap, is why this conversation matters. Not as theory, as your life. That is exactly where Paul Newhouse's research lands when you understand what it actually says. Around 2009, Newhouse walked into a conference room at Vanderbilt with data from clinical trials using nicotine patches on older adults with mild cognitive impairment. Not cigarettes, not vaping. Transdermal patches delivering roughly 2 milligrams across 16 hours. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something real doesn't fit the framework everyone has been comfortable with. Attention had improved. Processing speed had improved. Memory task performance had improved. Measurably, reproducibly, and without the tolerance escalation that makes most stimulants collapse into uselessness within weeks. This is where biohacking, as a serious practice rather than a trend, earns its place in the conversation, not as self-experimentation for its own sake, but as the discipline of applying real biological levers, precisely, systematically, with honest accounting of what is known and what is not, to extend the period of life in which you function at your actual capacity. The law of vibration holds that everything is in motion, that your internal state is transmitting something at all times, and the law of attraction answers that signal. What biohacking offers, at its most rigorous, is a methodology for changing what you're transmitting, not through belief alone, but through the body chemistry that underlies belief. When your receptors are declining and your processing slows, the signal changes before you notice it consciously. The work is to intervene at that level deliberately before the drift becomes a direction. Nicotine, in this specific context, binds to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors distributed through the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the basal ganglia. A 55-year-old brain has been losing density in those receptors for roughly a decade. You probably noticed the effects before you name the cause. The name that needs an extra second. The thread of an argument that feels slightly harder to hold in a meeting. The tip of a word your mouth is waiting for while your mind looks for it in the next room. Nicotine, at low doses, partially compensates for that receptor decline. It triggers a mild dopamine response and a modest norepinephrine lift, which is why attention sharpens in the hour after application. The National Institute on Aging considered this mechanism serious enough to fund. That is the real signal. Now the noise. The dose window is narrow and the delivery method is not a footnote. It is the entire variable. Patches delivering 2 milligrams over 16 hours that produce a slow, even absorption. The brain experiences this as a quiet tide. Inhaled nicotine reaches the brain in roughly 8 seconds. A spike that saturates receptors, drives a larger dopamine surge, and begins building the architecture of dependence almost immediately. The same compound, received 2 different ways, behaves as if it were nearly a different substance. One builds tolerance fast. The other, in Newhouse's trial population, showed no measurable tolerance escalation across 6 months. But you need to hold that finding carefully because those were people with mild cognitive impairment, selected for specific receptor profiles, monitored clinically without the comorbidities that would have disqualified them. They were not healthy men in their late 40s who read something compelling and ordered patches online. The extrapolation from that population to you is significant, not impossible. Significant. Here is where you want direct language, not softening. Nicotine raises heart rate. It raises blood pressure transiently. It promotes platelet aggregation and mild vasoconstriction. In a 25-year-old with a clean cardiovascular profile, these are manageable perturbations. In a 55-year-old with mildly elevated blood pressure, early arterial stiffening, or metabolic syndrome. Conditions that are common in this age group, not exceptional. Those effects accumulate differently. The risk calculus changes, not necessarily prohibitively, but meaningfully. The biohacker community generally makes 2 moves in response. The first is sound. The distinction between combustion products and pure nicotine is real and well supported. The lung and cardiovascular damage from smoking comes overwhelmingly from the 1,000+ compounds produced by burning, not from nicotine itself. The second move is less defensible. The quiet slide from nicotine may benefit cognitively impaired older adults under clinical conditions to nicotine is a performance enhancer for healthy aging adults. That second claim does not have the same foundation. It is extrapolation, intelligent extrapolation, built on plausible mechanism, but extrapolation nonetheless. There's a difference between a plausible hypothesis and a validated protocol, and that difference is where people get hurt. The smell of a research conference room stays with you if you have ever sat in one. Cool air cycling through ducts, faintly metallic, the specific flatness of a space insulated from weather and season, where the only thing that moves is information. Newhouse's data sat in that air, real and partial and genuinely useful, sharp at the edges but not yet complete. That is where the science still lives. Real signal, real risks, and a precision that has not fully arrived. Which means the choice, if you're considering it, belongs to you, not to the trend, not to the enthusiast literature that has already decided. It belongs to your specific cardiovascular profile, your specific receptor landscape, your specific accounting of what you're trying to protect and what you're willing to risk to protect it. And here is what the vibration underneath all of this actually is. You are not afraid of a patch. You're not afraid of a clinical trial. You are responding to the felt sense that you are still in motion, that the signal you are sending has not peaked, that the man in the next decade of your life is not a diminished version of this one. That instinct is not denial. It is the right transmission. The work, biological, psychological, both at once, is to build the conditions that make it true. That is what serious biohacking is for. That is why the question is worth asking with this kind of care. There's a search term that almost nobody says out loud. Type it into Google, and the algorithm fills it in before you finish the third word. Brain fog after, and then it waits because it already knows the rest. Asterisk after 50, after 45, after I turned 52 and suddenly couldn't hold a thought the way I used to. Asterisk. Millions of searches, done alone when the house is settled and the screen is the only light on. What drives them isn't fascination with nootropics or curiosity about whatever supplement protocol is circulating this month. It's something more specific and more private. The experience of watching your own mind work differently than it used to and not being sure whether that's temporary or just how things are now. Whether it's weather or whether it's the new climate. Nobody calls it fear. That word feels outsized. Instead, people call it not being as sharp as I was. They call it struggling to multitask. They call it brain fog, a term so soft, so meteorological, that it makes the things sound like something passing through. Something outside of you. Most people over 45 already know it isn't. Picture the moment clearly, because it's worth sitting inside for a second. It's late. The candle from earlier in the evening has been out long enough that only the faintest trace of it remains in the room. Wax and smoke, almost nothing. The cursor is blinking, and the person typing isn't researching in the way they'd research a vacation or a used car. They're confessing to themselves quietly through a keyboard that something feels different, that the word that used to arrive immediately now takes a half beat too long, that in a meeting full of people a decade younger, the gap, however small, however invisible to anyone else, was noticeable to them. This is the fear that doesn't have a name on a chart. It doesn't announce itself. It lives in the pause between the thought and the word. In the moment you walk into a room and have to reconstruct why. In the name that used to come easily and now requires a search. And it is driving an industry. The nootropic market, supplements, peptides, smart drugs, nicotine in its various modern forms, isn't being built primarily by 25-year-old founders squeezing productivity out of Tuesday. It's being built quietly by people in their late 40s and 50s who are looking for a way to stay. Stay competitive. Stay present. Stay relevant in environments where the performance baseline is increasingly set by people 15 years younger, whose cognitive systems are still running on what feels like full power. That pressure isn't imagined. It isn't vanity. A 2022 analysis in neurology found that processing speed, the rate at which the brain sorts and responds to new information, begins a measurable decline as early as 45 in some cognitive domains. Not catastrophic, not dementia, but measurable in the texture of daily life long before it shows up on any medical chart. What makes that finding complicated is the variation. A longitudinal study from Duke University's Center for Cognitive Neuroscience tracked adults between 45 and 70 over 18 years, and the spread across participants was striking. Some people's processing speed and working memory held or even improved into their late 50s. Others showed steep, early decline. Same age range, vastly different trajectories. When the researchers looked for what separated one group from the other, lifestyle factors, sleep, diet, movement, explained some of the difference, but not most of it. The largest share of variance across the dataset was something the researchers described carefully, in a measured language academic papers require: chronic affective load. The sustained emotional background of a person's daily experience. Whether the nervous system, day after day, was operating from a baseline of threat or a baseline of safety. Not acute stress. Everyone faces that. Chronic, bien, the low, persistent hum of a system that has been running defense protocols for so long it no longer recognizes the default. What that actually looks like in the body is worth slowing down for. Not as a biology lecture, but because feeling it land differently changes how you read your own experience. The brain's dopamine circuitry, the system governing motivation, focus, learning, reward, doesn't operate independently of everything else. It's continuously calibrated by the body's threat detection architecture. When that architecture has been running hot for months or years, something specific happens to dopamine transmission. The sharp, precise bursts that fire when you lock onto a problem, learn something new, or hold a complex argument together get suppressed. The brain throttles that function in favor of vigilance. Scanning, rapid reactivity. For an organism in genuine danger, that's the right trade. You don't need creative problem solving when the threat is immediate. But for a 53-year-old trying to hold a room while also managing the quiet anxiety that someone younger might do it faster, the threat architecture is running anyway. Not dramatically, just continuously beneath the surface, shaping what the system prioritizes. Acetylcholine moves in parallel. It's the neurotransmitter most directly tied to attention, to encoding new memories, to the kind of focused precision people describe losing first. Its availability is partly regulated by vagal tone, which responds to chronic emotional state. A nervous system running low-grade defense mode has measurably different vagal tone than one that doesn't, and different cognitive output as a result. This is why the conversation about cholinergic compounds as cognitive tools stays permanently incomplete if it starts and ends with the chemistry. Asking whether you can top up the neurotransmitter is reasonable. But the more foundational question is what kind of internal environment that neurotransmitter is being asked to work inside. A system running chronic threat protocols doesn't just need more input. It needs a different state. The state governs the machinery, which is where the laws of vibration and attraction stop being philosophical concepts and start being biological ones. Your dominant emotional frequency, not as metaphor, but as the actual baseline your nervous system is calibrated to, is determining the neurochemical environment in which every protocol, every supplement, every habit you built is either working well or working against itself. The signal you're broadcasting internally is the ground condition for everything else. Most biohacking conversations skip this entirely. They optimize the inputs without examining the field those inputs are landing in. And people feel it. They do the things, they track the markers, and something still feels slightly off. Not because the tools are wrong, but because the deeper state hasn't shifted. The fear of cognitive decline is real and grounded. What people over 45 are sensing, they're actually sensing. The searches are not paranoid. The gap is not imagined, but something worth considering, something the data points toward, and that most of the conversation around this topic quietly sidesteps, is what happens when the fear itself becomes the chronic condition. When a worry about losing cognitive capacity becomes the persistent background frequency of a person's daily life. When a nervous system is running defense protocols not in response to a real threat, but in response to the anticipation of one. Because the mechanism doesn't distinguish. The biological response to something bad is happening, and something bad might happen looks the same from the inside of cell. And if what's suppressing the dopamine signal, degrading the acetylcholine availability, and narrowing the cognitive trajectory is chronic threat state, then fear of decline, held without resolution, examined without tools, woven into the background of daily life, becomes part of what's driving the decline. That's not a philosophical point. It's the part of this conversation that changes what you do with everything else. There's a kitchen table in this story. Scarred wood, the kind that holds coffee rings from years of mornings. A window above it that faces east, so the light comes in low and direct, and by mid-afternoon the room is dim again. David knows this table the way you know furniture you've sat at during the difficult hours. He is sitting there now. He has been doing everything right for 3 years. Not obsessively, methodically. He tracked his sleep. He cut the alcohol. He walked 45 minutes every morning before the sun cleared the tree line. He took the supplements in the right order, at the right times, with the right food. He read the studies. He listened to the podcasts. He built what looked from the outside like a very serious relationship with his own biology. And then one afternoon, mid-sentence, with the afternoon light already gone and the kitchen going gray, something surfaces. He is afraid. Not of anything particular, of everything in general, of forgetting a word mid-sentence, of walking into a room and losing the reason he came, of the moment still somewhere ahead when the sharpness leaves for good. He's been afraid the entire time. The protocol hasn't softened it. If anything, the protocol has given the fear a structure, a schedule, a daily ritual in which to live. That is the open loop this chapter was always building toward. The question seated earlier, can the chronic fear of losing your mind actually accelerate the very decline you're trying to prevent? The answer is not rhetorical. There's a smell in a neuroimaging lab that most people never notice. Not antiseptic exactly, something closer to warm plastic and recycled air, the particular stillness of a room where brains are being watched. Amy Arntzen has spent decades in rooms like that. At Yale, mapping what happens to the prefrontal cortex under sustained psychological stress. Not acute stress, not the moment of impact, not the emergency, but the low, chronic kind. The kind David carries. The kind a lot of people over 45 carry without naming it. What Arntzen's work shows, mapped carefully without drama, is this: the prefrontal cortex, the region most responsible for working memory, attention, executive function, the things we associate with cognitive sharpness, is exquisitely, almost punishingly sensitive to sustained stress signaling. Under acute threat, the brain reassigns resources. That is adaptive. That is the system working as designed. But when the threat signal never turns off, when the alarm becomes the wallpaper, the prefrontal cortex does not simply take a back seat. It undergoes measurable structural and functional changes. Dendritic retraction, synaptic pruning, reduced signal-to-noise in the very circuits governing the thing you're most afraid of losing. The fear of cognitive decline, held chronically, activates the precise neurological conditions that produce it, not as metaphor, as mechanism. Now bring in a second layer. Rajita Sinha, also at Yale, has spent years studying what threat states do to neurotransmitter systems specifically. In her research on cholinergic circuitry under conditions of chronic perceived threat is the part of this story that most of the biohacking conversation skips entirely. Acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter at the center of the nicotine patch conversation, at the center of the cognitive biohack trend this entire video is examining, is not simply depleted by age. Its availability and its receptor sensitivity are profoundly shaped by the neurochemical environment in which those circuits operate. Sinha's work on stress-induced disruption of cholinergic signaling demonstrates that a brain living in a sustained state of threat perception has fundamentally impaired capacity to use its own acetylcholine efficiently, regardless of how much is available. Which means the man who patches himself in the name of cognitive enhancement while simultaneously running a background operating system of vigilance, monitoring, and fear about his own brain. That man is working against his own intervention. Not because the intervention is worthless, because the internal environment he brings to it determines what the intervention can reach. There's a word researchers use for this kind of self-defeating loop: allostatic overload. The thermostat that cannot find the set point because it keeps receiving the signal that the temperature is wrong. The system that allocates resources toward defending rather than building because it has decided somewhere below conscious awareness that this is not a time for construction. This is a time for readiness. And here is what that readiness costs biologically in a brain over 50. The dopaminergic system, responsible not just for pleasure but for motivation, for the feeling that something is worth pursuing, for the anticipatory engagement that keeps cognitive circuits firing, operates differently in a brain that has been running threat protocols for months or years. Not broken, different. The mesolimbic pathway narrows its scope. The orbitofrontal integration of future reward gets crowded out by present threat assessment. Think of the book, the one on David's nightstand, spine uncracked for 2 weeks, its cover facing up in the thin morning light like an accusation. It used to be that a book pulled him in on the first page. Now there's a negotiation, a kind of heaviness before the first paragraph, a low reluctance that feels like fatigue but sits slightly above it. That is not laziness. That is not age arriving on schedule. That is a dopaminergic system running on a narrowed frequency because it has been quietly recruited for a different job, one nobody hired it to do consciously. The reframe this chapter is offering is precise, not philosophical. It is not saying, think positive thoughts and your brain will be fine. It is saying something more uncomfortable and more specific than that. It is saying that the internal state of the person pursuing cognitive clarity is itself a biological variable, one that directly modulates the same neurotransmitter systems that every supplement, every patch, every protocol is attempting to optimize from the outside. The state is not a backdrop to the intervention. The state is part of the intervention. In some cases, the state is the variable that determines whether the intervention has any runway at all. This is where the law of vibration stops being a wellness world abstraction and becomes a measurable claim. The frequency at which your nervous system is operating, threat or safety, contraction or openness, is not mood. It is a neurochemical context. And neurochemical contexts are the medium through which every external intervention either lands or fails to. What the law of attraction points toward, imprecisely and often badly, is this more granular truth. That internal states are upstream of outcomes not because of magnetism, but because of receptor sensitivity, because of signal-to-noise ratios in prefrontal circuits, because of whether the dopaminergic system is available for forward-looking engagement or occupied elsewhere. David, sitting at his scarred kitchen table with the light failing, was not failing at biohacking. He was demonstrating its most commonly missing variable. The work is not only about the protocol. The work is about what you carry in, which makes the next question not abstract at all. If the internal state is the variable, and if that state is not fixed, not a personality trait, not an irreversible feature of having lived through things, then changing it is not a matter of motivation or willpower. It is a biological project with the same specificity as any other. And for a nervous system over 50, with a history, with years of accumulated pattern, the path to that change is not the same as it is at 30. The next chapter lives there. What it actually looks like in an unremarkable Wednesday morning, in a body that has already tried the protocol and found the fear still running underneath it, to shift the state in a way the biology can register in use. Not in theory, in the specific, unglamorous texture of a morning that hasn't decided yet what it will be. There's a story that ran in The Guardian in the spring of 2023 that most people in the wellness space never picked up. Not because it wasn't significant, but because it didn't fit the frame everyone was already selling. The headline was about Nora Fokow. The piece covered her work on the aging dopamine system, specifically PET imaging studies conducted at the National Institute on Drug Abuse showing that dopamine D2 receptor density in the striatum declines by roughly 13% per decade, starting in a person's 30s. By the time you're in your early 50s, you've lost a meaningful fraction of the receptors most responsible for motivation, anticipation, and the ability to hold a thought long enough to do something with it. That's the number. 13% per decade. Not from disease. Not for choices you made. From time, measured cleanly, replicated across populations. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not to frighten you, but because what comes next only lands if you feel the weight of what it's sitting against. Here's what Fokow's group found that the Guardian article mentioned and then moved past too quickly. The 50-year-old brain is not a damaged 30-year-old brain. It is a structurally distinct brain. It runs on a fundamentally different dopaminergic map. And that map, when you understand it, changes almost everything about how you navigate what's happening inside you right now. The younger brain is a phasic dopamine specialist. Sharp spikes, fast rewards, the electric hit of novelty. Every new thing, every buzz, every rush of wanting. That's phasic release doing its work. The 30-year-old brain is exceptional at that spike, built for it, dependent on it, oriented around it in ways that are mostly invisible until the spike starts quieting. Your brain runs differently now. The phasic hit becomes less dramatic, not gone but quieter. What the aging dopamine system does increasingly well, if conditions are right, is tonic dopamine. The slower background hum of baseline motivation that sustains attention across long stretches, supports deliberate judgment, underpins what researchers call motivated persistence. Not the excitement of starting something, the capacity to care steadily across hours and days when a novelty has worn off and the work is still in front of you. Walk into a room where serious work has accumulated over decades. The researchers at the Aging Brain Center at Penn have documented, through longitudinal neuroimaging, that prefrontal engagement in adults over 50 increases on tasks that younger subjects process automatically. The older brain recruits more considered, deliberate processing where the younger brain just fires. This is the instrument you have now. It is built for that room. But there's a word in that last sentence carrying all the weight. If conditions are right. Because the structural difference between a 50-year-old dopamine system functioning well and one that isn't has less to do with receptor density than most people assume. Receptor loss is real, but receptor sensitivity, the responsiveness of what remains, is a variable. And that variable is regulated in significant part by something the supplement industry has no product for. The mechanism is specific, not metaphorical. Dopaminergic tone, the background level at which your system operates, is directly modulated by your brain's stress architecture. Prolonged activation of the HPA axis alters dopamine synthesis through two distinct pathways. First, chronically elevated glucocorticoid signaling downregulates tyrosine hydroxylase, the enzyme required to produce dopamine at all. Second, it dysregulates the mesolimbic projection from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, flattening the system's responsiveness in exactly the way that produces what clinicians recognize as anhedonia. Not quite depression, just the flatness. The day losing its texture. The sense that things that used to matter somehow don't pull the same way anymore. The Aging Brain Center found, in their cohort of adults between 48 and 72, that the single strongest predictor of preserved dopaminergic function wasn't age, diet, or exercise frequency. It was emotional regulatory stability, the degree to which a person's baseline internal state remained relatively consistent and wasn't dominated by chronic anticipatory threat. That phrase, anticipatory threat, I want you to feel what it's pointing at, not fear of something identifiable. The background orientation of a nervous system that has learned to treat the future as inherently unsafe, slightly braced, slightly ahead of itself. Waiting. After 45, the culture becomes very good at feeding that orientation. Decline narratives, financial anxiety, the sense that your body is now a project requiring constant defensive management. A law of vibration argument would say you're broadcasting a frequency of scarcity, of contraction, of threat, and your neurochemistry, it turns out, agrees. The tonic system that should be sustaining motivated persistence begins reallocating toward vigilance instead. You feel it not as a neurochemical event, but as something harder to name, a narrowing of what seems possible, a subtle resistance to beginning things, a preference for the known that feels like wisdom but sometimes isn't. UCLA's Memory and Aging Research Center tracked adults across the 50 to 70 range and found that individuals with lower baseline threat orientation show preserved dopaminergic responsiveness that, in some cases, doesn't fit the standard receptor loss model at all. The system responds to the emotional environment it inhabits chronically, not just acutely. This is the attraction principle operating at the level of enzyme synthesis. Your dominant internal state is not a mood. It is a biological instruction, which means the question you actually need to be asking is not which protocol to optimize. It's what you are vibrating at underneath the protocols. The 50-year-old brain runs on a map that can take you somewhere the 30-year-old brain was genuinely not equipped to go. Deeper focus, sustained seriousness, the specific intelligence that only comes from having stayed with something long enough to understand it. That map is available to you. The research is unambiguous that it doesn't disappear with age, but it requires a particular interior condition to activate. Not positive thinking in the soft, decorative sense. A genuine, practiced shift in baseline state, away from chronic low-grade threat, and toward what the researchers measured as regulatory stability and what the mindset framework we've been building across these chapters calls coherence. The state where your nervous system is no longer spending dopamine on vigilance, and the system that's built for motivated persistence can actually do its job. The exterior variables matter. Sleep matters, movement matters, the inputs matter. But you've been running the exterior protocol and still feeling it. That narrowing, that resistance, that flatness with no obvious cause. That's the data, and it's telling you exactly where to look next. There is a moment, usually late, when something you already knew stops being information and becomes weight. You have read the articles. You have watched the videos. You have noted the supplements, maybe ordered one or two. And somewhere underneath all of that activity is a question that does not quite make it to the surface. Not because you're avoiding it, but because it is harder to locate than a question about dosage or timing. It is more like a feeling than a question. Something about whether any of it will actually work. Whether you are the kind of person it will work for. That feeling has a biochemistry. And the biochemistry has a name in the research, even if the research rarely leads with it. There is a study out of Northwestern University that almost nobody talks about outside of specialist conferences. Not because it was small, and not because the findings were ambiguous, but because what it found sits at an uncomfortable intersection. The kind of place where hard biology and something that sounds uncomfortably like inner life press up against each other, and neither camp moves to claim the territory. Two groups of adults, both over 50, both with comparable baseline cognitive scores, comparable sleep, comparable diet. Researchers tracked them across 4 years, measuring dopaminergic signaling, specifically the density and sensitivity of D2 receptors in the striatum, the region most implicated in motivation, learning, and what they call cognitive updating, the brain's ability to register new information as relevant and act on it. The groups diverged, not slightly, substantially. The variable that predicted the divergence most reliably was not a supplement protocol, not exercise frequency, not even sleep quality, though sleep quality mattered. The single most predictive variable was what the researchers labeled chronic affective tone, a term that sounds clinical until you understand what it is pointing at. It means the emotional weather a person lives inside day after day without necessarily noticing it. Not clinical depression, not a diagnosed anxiety disorder. Something subtler and, in some ways, more insidious. A persistent low-grade state of vigilance, of bracing, of waiting for something to go wrong. The researchers measured it through a combination of self-report instruments and, crucially, through morning cortisol awakening response, the spike the body produces in the first 30 minutes after waking, calibrating itself for the day ahead. In people with high chronic vigilance effect, that morning calibration was blunted. The spike came, but it was flatter, less defined. A signal trying to transmit through interference. The D2 receptor density in those individuals, the very receptors that nicotine patches interact with, that acetylcholine cascades through, that every serious nootropic on the market is attempting to engage, was measurably lower. Not from age alone. From the chronic biochemical environment those receptors have been living inside for years. This is how chronic emotional state translates into specific neurochemical terrain. Not metaphorically, literally. The HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, when held in a state of low, sustained activation, the kind you never feel as acute stress, but carry the way you carry the smell of your own house, begins to compress the systems downstream of it. Dopamine synthesis rates slow. The ratio of dopamine to its metabolites shifts. The striatum becomes, in the language of the Northwestern paper, less receptive to novelty signaling, which is a precise scientific way of saying the brain stops updating. It stops being curious. It starts being defended. There's a specific texture to this state that most people over 50 recognize when it is named clearly. It is not sadness. It is not exhaustion, exactly. It is more like a slight narrowing of the aperture. Foods taste slightly less vivid. A piece of music you loved reaches you, but the last few inches of that reach feel like it is moving through something thick. You notice a sunset, but the noticing feels like watching something happen to someone else. The morning carries the faint bite of old wood, the smell of a house where the windows have been shut too long. And that is not a bad image for what is happening in the brain. Not shut down, just not open. That is reduced dopaminergic gain. The brain's dimmer switch turned not off, but down by 3 or 4 degrees. Enough to matter. Enough to be the difference between a cognitive protocol that changes your life and the same protocol that produces nothing, which you then add to the long list of things that were supposed to help and didn't. The fear of cognitive decline, the specific, grinding background anxiety that a significant percentage of adults over 45 carry without ever calling it that, is not a neutral observer of the decline it fears. It is a participant in it. The vigilant state that fear produces is itself one of the mechanisms that accelerates the very trajectory it is trying to prevent. A man reads about dementia risk. His internal environment shifts slightly toward threat detection. His HPA axis adjusts. His morning cortisol awakening response flattens over months. His D2 receptor sensitivity begins, incrementally, to compress. He reads more about dementia risk because his brain is now in a slightly more defended, less updating state, and defended brains seek evidence that the threat is real. The loop closes. This is not cortisol as the villain in a simple stress narrative. This is the cholinergic dopaminergic interface under chronic field conditions that most cognitive research still treats as noise. Choline acetyltransferase, the enzyme that synthesizes acetylcholine in the basal forebrain, is particularly sensitive to glucocorticoid exposure. Not the kind that comes from a single bad day. The kind that comes from years of a nervous system that never fully downregulates because the threat it is monitoring is not a predator, but a concept. The concept of becoming less. When that enzyme's expression is chronically suppressed, the cholinergic system that governs attention, memory consolidation, and what researchers call synaptic tagging, the process by which the brain decides which experiences are worth storing, becomes less efficient. You can add precursors. You can add alpha-GPC, CDP-choline, the compounds that show genuine promise in the literature. You can apply a low-dose nicotine intervention that research suggests can genuinely upregulate nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. But you're adding these things into a field that is already partially closed. The chronic emotional frequency a person maintains is not separate from their biochemistry. It is the biochemistry. The internal field precedes the intervention. It determines whether the window is open or shut before the compound, the protocol, the supplement, or the practice ever arrives. A 2021 paper from the University of Rochester put it with unusual directness for academic writing. They were studying what they called allostatic emotional load, the cumulative metabolic cost of sustained negative affective states. And their conclusion was this: the chronically defended internal environment represents a target for intervention prior to and distinct from any cognitive enhancement strategy. Prior to, distinct from, not also important, not worth considering alongside, prior. This is what the nicotine conversation, in all of its conservative media coverage and biohacker enthusiasm, largely skips, because it is harder to sell. You cannot put a prior condition in a bottle. You cannot put first resolve, the biochemical environment created by your chronic emotional state, on a supplement label. But the data does not skip it. The late neuroscientist Jake Panksepp spent his career mapping what he called the primary emotional systems of the mammalian brain. Somewhere in that work, he observes that the seeking system, the dopaminergic engine of curiosity and forward motion, is not simply a cognitive tool. It is an emotional state, the feeling of being genuinely open to what comes next. When that system is healthy and well-resourced, a compound that engages, it finds purchase. When it has been compressed by years of low-grade fear, even a genuine amplifier arrives into silence. What you carry into the protocol is the variable the protocol cannot control, which means the work is not only in the stack, it is in the field the stack lands in. And that field, not your mood, not your mindset, but a measurable physiological state, can be deliberately changed. The research on how to do that is more specific, more actionable, and more grounded in current neuroscience than it has any right to be, given how rarely anyone in this conversation mentions it. It requires nothing exotic. It requires understanding what the seeking system actually needs to come back online, and then giving it that consistently before reaching for anything else. That is where this goes next. Picture this. It's 11:47 p.m., and somewhere in a city you've never visited, A 52-year-old man named David is sitting at a kitchen table under fluorescent light, holding a small transdermal patch between two fingers. He's read the studies. He's watched the videos. He's got a spreadsheet, actual color-coded cells, tracking his sleep scores, his HRV readings, his reaction times on a cognitive app he paid $14 a month to access. He has done everything right. He presses the patch to his upper arm, and nothing happens. Or something happens, but it's not what the studies promised. There's a kind of wired flatness, sharper around the edges, but somehow smaller inside. His heart rate ticks upward. He feels alert the way a cornered animal is alert. He opens the spreadsheet and adds a data point, and the cursor blinks at him in the quiet kitchen, and he thinks, what am I doing wrong? He's not doing anything wrong. That's the thing. That's what nobody told him. Here's what the research actually found. And I want you to stay with this because it changes how everything else lands. Two groups, same compound, same dose, same duration, identical protocol down to the hour of administration. One group walks out with cognitive results so clean the researchers thought the files had been mislabeled. The other group shows outcomes so flat they look like noise. When a lead researcher talks about this afterward, in an interview, slightly uncomfortable, the way scientists get when data refuses to behave, she says they went back through everything. Twice, looking for the error. There was no error. What separated those groups wasn't age, wasn't baseline cognition, wasn't diet, sleep quality, or any variable the study had been designed to measure. The only thing the researchers could identify, pulled from intake interviews, inferred rather than controlled for, was this: one group arrived curious, open, actually interested in what might happen. The other group arrived afraid of what the next decade would do to them, afraid they were already losing something they couldn't get back. Same patch, different internal climate, radically different brains. Feel what that means for a moment, because I don't want to rush past it. Now, and this matters, the biohacking movement deserves real credit before we go any further. It looked at the human body and said, this is a modifiable system. The variables governing its function are not fixed at 40, not fixed at 50, not fixed at any threshold the cultural story told you to fear. The dogma that cognitive decline is inevitable, that past a certain point the trajectory is essentially set. That dogma has actual victims. People who stopped investing in themselves because the story said the investment wouldn't pay. People who surrendered neuroplasticity they still had. The biohacking world pushed back on that with evidence, with rigor, with a disciplined refusal to accept surrender as inevitable. That contribution is real, and it deserves to be said out loud. But here's where it went wrong. Quietly wrong. Wrong in a way that hides inside the language of sophistication. The framework, as it's practiced and evangelized, treats the internal state as secondary, something to optimize around, not through. The supplement is the active ingredient. The timing, the stack, the cycling protocol, those are the levers. The emotional and neurochemical climate of the person using them, background noise, a fixed container. Pour the intervention in, observe the output. David's kitchen table, 11:47 p.m. The cursor blinking. Think about what curiosity does to dopamine. Not performed optimism, actual open-ended interest in what might happen. In that state, dopamine functions as an anticipation signal. a reward prediction mechanism that is genuinely enhanced by uncertainty. Uncertainty in a curious brain is interesting. The system leans toward it. Learning consolidates. Patterns surface. The prefrontal cortex runs in a mode built for exactly this kind of focused, expansive attention. Now, think about chronic performance anxiety. That low hum of dread that sounds like diligence, but isn't. In that state, the same dopaminergic pathways are running threat assessment, monitoring for failure. The reward prediction mechanism gets hijacked by fear avoidance, and dopamine, instead of amplifying plasticity, starts functioning as a stress modulator. The signal changes. The same neurotransmitter in a different internal weather does a completely different job. Nicotine's mechanism is at nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. It mimics acetylcholine, which governs attention, learning consolidation, focused arousal. The research is solid, but acetylcholine doesn't work in isolation. It works in relationship with everything else the brain is already doing, and in a brain running on low-grade fear, on the cortisol signature of someone monitoring themselves for signs of decline. Nicotinic receptor sensitivity is already altered. You patch that brain, and you get a brittle, slightly jittery sharpness. Clarity that doesn't consolidate. The hippocampus, bathed in stress hormones, doesn't encode properly. So you add another intervention, and another. David adds a data point and closes the laptop, and the kitchen is very quiet. The person in the curious state patches the same compound into a completely different internal environment. Their prefrontal cortex is already running in the mode that supports top-down attention control. The acetylcholine stimulation lands on a receptive system. The protocol does exactly what the literature said it would do, not because of the nicotine primarily, but because of the field the nicotine is working inside. This is not a nuance for researchers. This is not a footnote. This is the difference between a tool and the ground the tool is used in. And here's what I want you to hear. If you've tried any of this and it worked inconsistently or worked brilliantly for someone else and did almost nothing for you despite following the protocol exactly, that inconsistency has a mechanism. It's not randomness. It's not your particular biochemistry being somehow defective. It's the internal climate you brought to the intervention. It's what was already running in the background when you applied the patch, swallowed the capsule, sat down to work. Which means there's something underneath the protocol that the protocol can't fix. Something that has to come first. And here's what I want you to leave this with. Not a cliffhanger, not a deferral, but something you can use right now. The internal state is not fixed. That's the actual news. The neurochemical climate you bring to any intervention is itself an intervention. And unlike the supplement, it costs nothing, it can't be counterfeit, and there is no dose-response ceiling. You have more agency over the ground than over the tool. The researchers in that study found it by accident. You don't have to. David closes the spreadsheet. The cursor blinks once more and goes dark. The patch is still on his arm. Tomorrow he'll approach it differently. Not because he's changed the protocol, but because he's finally identified what the protocol was always missing. So have you. You already know what it feels like when your thinking slows down. Not dramatically. Not the kind of thing you describe to a doctor. Just a beat longer to find the word. A name that used to come immediately that now makes you wait. A conversation where you were sharp and present, and then somewhere in the middle of it, You weren't quite. You noticed. You moved on. But you noticed. That's where this chapter starts. Not with a supplement. Not with a protocol. With that moment you've probably been carrying quietly for longer than you've said out loud. Here's what nobody tells you about what's actually happening in that moment. Michael Merzenich spent 40 years studying adult brains. Not young ones, not damaged ones, but the kind you and I are walking around with right now, in our 50s and 60s. And what his lab kept finding over and over is something that took the scientific community a long time to accept. The brain at this age is not locked. It is not in decline. It is conditionally plastic. And the condition has nothing to do with youth. The condition is genuine challenge. Not scrolling. Not a podcast running while you fold laundry. Actual structured novelty. Something that sits just past the edge of what you can currently do, that makes your attention grip, that you cannot coast through on habit or pattern recognition. When that kind of engagement is present, the basal forebrain, which is the brain's primary source of acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter that runs focus, encoding, and learning, increases its output. Not because of a pill, because the system was asked a real question and it answered. When that kind of engagement is absent, and when it's been replaced slowly by the low-level vigilance that comes with years of pressure and responsibility, the output quietly recedes. Like a tide going out. No alarm, no bios moment. Just a waterline that nobody marked until it was already lower than you remembered. Think about that for a second. Not as a fact to file away, as something that might be describing your last 2 years. There's something else Merzenich's work points to that the biohacking world tends to skip over. The dietary substrate. Acetylcholine is built from choline, and after 40, the pathway your body uses to produce its own becomes measurably less efficient. Eggs are one of the most concentrated food sources, not a superfood myth, just biochemistry. Liver, which almost nobody eats anymore. Soybeans, shiitake mushrooms, cruciferous vegetables. This doesn't announce its absence as a symptom. It just quietly narrows the range of what the system can produce. You never get a memo saying your choline is low. You just notice the waterline. Now here's where something larger has to enter the picture, because the mechanics alone won't get you there. There's a principle running through physics and through every serious tradition of human development that most people either dismiss or misunderstand. The law of vibration says that everything, including the internal state you carry through your day, operates at a frequency, and that frequency is not decorative. It is functional. It changes the chemistry. It changes what the nervous system is capable of producing, recruiting, consolidating. And its partner, the law of attraction, is not about wishful thinking or vision boards. It's about coherence. The idea that the internal state you inhabit most consistently determines what you can receive, integrate, and build toward. A brain running in low-grade fear cannot fully use what you feed it. A brain running in something closer to settled readiness can use almost anything. This is not metaphor. The autonomic nervous system is the physical bridge between those principles and your neurochemistry. And right now, for most people over 45 who have been carrying what you've been carrying, the autonomic system is tilted the wrong direction. Not broken, tilted toward vigilance, toward a cortisol slope that stays elevated later into the day than it should, that pulls slow-wave sleep apart at the seams. that tells the dopaminergic system there is no reward worth reaching for because the environment is still threatening. That's the gate. Matthew Walker's sleep research makes this precise. During deep non-REM sleep, acetylcholine drops significantly, not as a malfunction, but as the design. The low acetylcholine window is exactly when the hippocampus replays the day's learning into cortical storage. When the autonomic system doesn't fully downregulate at night. When the body carries its tension through into sleep because it never found a reason to let go. That consolidation is incomplete. Everything you engaged with during the day, every genuine cognitive challenge, every piece of new information, it doesn't fully land. The system does the work. The filing never happens. So when someone tells you that you just need to sleep more, they're not wrong. They're just not far enough in. The question isn't duration. It's whether the internal conditions allow sleep to function as the neurological event it's supposed to be. And that brings us to something concrete you can do today. Not eventually. Today. 5 to 10 minutes of slow diaphragmatic breathing. With the exhale longer than the inhale, 4 counts in, 6 or 7 out, produces a measurable increase in heart rate variability within that single session. Not after a month of practice. In minutes. The vagus nerve is that responsive. And HRV, the flexibility of your autonomic system, is one of the best proxies we have for the internal climate everything else runs inside. Dopamine synthesis, acetylcholine release, the architecture of your sleep tonight, the plasticity response when you challenge your brain tomorrow morning. This is what the law of vibration looks like in the body. The frequency you carry into the night determines the quality of the repair. The internal state you practice during the day becomes the climate your neurochemistry operates inside. You are not a passive recipient of your own biology. You are, in a very literal sense, regulating it, or failing to, with every hour of how you live. So the picture is this: genuine cognitive challenge, not comfortable repetition. Choline from real food, not as an afterthought. Sleep protected, not just in hours, but in the autonomic conditions that make it actually work. And a daily practice of bringing the nervous system down. Not as a wellness ritual, not as something you do when you remember, but as the foundational act that makes every other tool reach the system it's aimed at. These aren't suggestions. They follow from the mechanism. If you understand what the system needs, they stop being optional. But there is one thing none of this fully reaches. Something that sits underneath the practices themselves. That was already shaping whether any of this could land before you knew what it was. That's where the next chapter goes. And it starts somewhere you probably weren't expecting. There is a moment most men over 40 know without having named it. You sit down to do something that matters, a decision you've been putting off, a problem that needs actual thinking, a conversation you need to be sharp for. And the mind that shows up is not the one you were counting on. It's fog at the edges. It moves slowly. It keeps sliding off the thing you needed to hold. The instinct is to treat that as a fuel problem. Caffeine, maybe something stronger, maybe the stack you read about at 11 on Tuesday. The assumption underneath the instinct is that the brain is an engine running low, and what it needs is more input. That assumption is wrong. And the place where it goes wrong is not subtle, it's structural. Here is what's actually happening in that moment. Your heart, not the metaphorical one, the electrical one, is broadcasting a pattern. The intervals between each beat are not uniform. They flex and shift, and the specific shape of that variation, the rhythm of the variability, is being read in real time by your brain via the vagus nerve running from brainstem to gut. The brain doesn't receive this signal passively. It uses it to determine what kind of cognitive mode to run. When that pattern is erratic, when variability is chaotic, irregular, stressed, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for complex reasoning, working memory, executive function, goes into a defensive configuration. Blood flow to the prefrontal lobes actually shifts. The brain is not malfunctioning. It is doing precisely what it was designed to do under perceived threat. It narrows, it prioritizes danger detection, it trades nuance for speed. You're not running low on fuel. You are running the wrong operating mode. Roland McCrady's group at the HeartMath Research Center in Boulder Creek spent 3 decades documenting this in controlled trials published in peer-reviewed journals, including the International Journal of Psychophysiology. What they found repeatedly and across cohorts is that the heart's rhythmic pattern, measurable as heart rate variability, functions as a broadcast signal that either suppresses or enables prefrontal function. McCrady calls the ordered state cardiac coherence, not the poetry of the term, the mechanics. When the variability pattern is smooth-waved and rhythmically organized, the prefrontal cortex comes back online. This is where the cholinergic conversation gets complicated in a way the biohacking space rarely acknowledges. The nicotinic receptors that cognitive stacks are designed to activate, the ones you're targeting with supplemental nicotine or choline precursors, sit inside a system that, under chronic sympathetic dominance, is actively down-regulating its own sensitivity. The receptor density degrades before you ever open the bottle. You can flood the synapse. You are flooding a compromised substrate. The internal environment governs what the external input can do, and the internal environment is not a given you inherit each morning. It is a state you either prepare or don't. Step 1 of the preparation is breath, and it is less passive than the word implies. Slow, diaphragmatic inhalation through the nose, belly-driven, 5 or 6 seconds, followed by a slightly longer exhalation. That asymmetry is doing something specific. The extended exhale activates the vagus nerve directly. It is one of the fastest known routes to reducing sympathetic tone. A 2018 study published in Psychophysiology out of Trinity College Dublin connected this exact breath pattern to norepinephrine regulation in the locus coeruleus, the brain's primary production site for the neurotransmitter most responsible for focused attention. 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. Nasal, rhythmic, not controlled in the sense of forced, coherent in the sense of smooth. 5 to 10 minutes. This alone is enough to shift the HRV pattern measurably on a standard wearable. McCrady's group tracked this in a cohort study and the cognitive outcomes. Reaction time, working memory performance, verbal fluency were not marginal improvements. In some subjects, they were comparable to results from pharmacological interventions. The dopaminergic and cholinergic systems don't operate in isolation. They operate in a neurochemical neighborhood, and the neighbor that determines whether the entire street is calm enough to function is the sympathetic-parasympathetic balance. You cannot selectively tune one transmitter while leaving the neighborhood in a state of alarm. The breath is not a wellness practice appended to the protocol. It is the protocol's foundation. Step 2 is less technical but equally precise. Open monitoring attention, sometimes called open awareness in the clinical literature, is a specific attentional state study at the University of Groningen at Radboud University and documented in a 2022 paper in Neuroimage examining default mode network activity in experienced practitioners. It is neurologically distinct from focused attention practices. The person does not direct attention at a single object. They hold awareness wide. The whole sensory field is present. No thread of it is prioritized. You sit somewhere with a window. Outside, whatever is there, a street, a tree line, early traffic moving in the gray. Your gaze softens without fixing on anything. The sounds in the room, the refrigerator cycling, a bird, a car, exist without you naming them. You are not achieving a state. You are not managing your mind. You are letting the attentional system open rather than narrow. What happens neurologically? The default mode network, the architecture of rumination and self-referential looping, deactivates. The frontoparietal network, governing flexible attention and working memory integration, comes online. And the acetylcholine signal, the neurotransmitter at the center of the cognitive biohacking conversation, becomes more tonically available because the muscarinic receptors in the cortex are specifically linked to this non-directed, panoramic attentional mode. The practice that most directly prepares the cholinergic system for peak function is not a supplement. It is a quality of attention practiced before anything else enters the picture. 10 minutes. You are not warming up spiritually. You are calibrating the instrument. The sequence then is this: 5 to 10 minutes of coherent diaphragmatic breathing. The autonomic state shifts. The HRV pattern changes. The heart's signal to the brain changes. The prefrontal cortex comes back online. 10 minutes of open awareness. The attentional system resets from narrow vigilant to wide receptive. The cholinergic substrate is primed. Then, and only then, does the question of what to introduce, nicotine, alpha-GPC, acetylcholine, nothing but black coffee in the morning, become a question worth asking carefully. Because now you're asking it from a prepared internal environment rather than a compromised one. The signal-to-noise ratio is different. The brain receiving the intervention is not the same brain you sat down with. What most men don't recognize until they've run this sequence enough times to feel the difference. The fog was never really about the fuel. It was about the state they were in when they reached for it. There's a moment most men don't talk about. Not because it's shameful, exactly, but because naming it feels like accelerating something they'd rather slow down. It usually arrives somewhere between 45 and 55. A word that won't come. A room you walked into with a clear purpose that has now, somehow, gone quiet. A conversation where the thread just dropped. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else noticed, but you noticed. And something tightened. Because it's happened before. Because you're keeping a list now, even if you never admitted the list. That tightening is the thing I want to start with. Not the word retrieval. Not the focus. Not the subjective sense that something that used to be effortless now costs something. The tightening, the bracing, the low-frequency hum of a man who has started wondering whether what's happening is the beginning of a permanent subtraction. That experience is real. It is not imagined, not dramatized, not the result of a man being too soft or too much in his head. It is a real thing happening in a real nervous system, and it deserves to be met with more honesty than the biohacking industry typically offers it, which is where this chapter needs to go. Picture a research lab, not a metaphor. An actual place, Johns Hopkins, 2021, PET scanners running warm in a room that smells like recycled air and old coffee, and the particular flat silence of serious work. Neuroscientists with their eyes on imaging data, watching dopamine receptor activity in adults between 45 and 65. Not addicts, not patients, just people. What the images showed was not what you'd expect from a conversation about aging. Receptor sensitivity, the brain's capacity to respond to dopamine already present in the system, varied wildly between subjects of identical age. Not by degrees, by a factor that meant some 50-year-old brains were running the reward circuitry of someone 15 years younger, while others looked like a radio losing its signal out in the flatlands. Struggling, reaching, the variable that best predicted which kind of brain you were looking at wasn't supplement history, wasn't genetics. It was something the researchers named carefully in the measured language of people who want to say something important without it sounding like a podcast. Chronic anticipatory threat activation, which is 12 syllables for how long has this person been braced? The smell of old paper, the kind that comes off a thick file left too long in a closed drawer, is what that phrase conjures for me. Something preserved in a state it was never meant to stay in. Kept tense, kept ready, waiting in the dark for a threat that may or may not be coming. Because that's what chronic bracing does to the dopaminergic system. Not in a single season, but over years of accumulated vigilance. It doesn't break the system cleanly. It keeps it running at partial activation, hot enough to stay ready, not hot enough to fully reward. The signal gets rationed through actual synaptic pruning, not metaphor. The brain learns that pleasure is scarce, that the next good thing is probably a setup, that the only safe posture is watchfulness. And then it starts to look from the inside exactly like cognitive decline. The word that won't come. The motivation that has gone flat, like a note held too long. The focus that breaks mid-sentence, mid-task, mid-thought. These aren't invented, but they don't always originate where the supplement industry says they do. A 2019 study from the University of Pittsburgh followed acetylcholine signaling, the chemistry most directly governing attention and memory in adults over 48. The question was whether cholinergic function was fixed by age and receptor density, or whether something else was running underneath it. What they found was that the same brain, same receptors, same baseline neurochemistry released measurably different amounts of acetylcholine depending on one thing: whether the person had been living in sustained, low-grade resistance or not. Not acute stress, not catastrophe, just the ordinary ambient friction of a life lived slightly braced. The kind that doesn't announce itself at breakfast. The kind that just makes everything cost slightly more than it used to. The researchers called what they were measuring the neuromodulatory environment, the internal chemical atmosphere that determines whether the brain's primary systems, dopamine, acetylcholine, serotonin, can actually function at the level the receptors technically allow. Not whether the hardware exists, whether the atmosphere permits it to run. That variable is almost never mentioned in conversations about cognitive biohacking. Not because it's obscure, because it's uncomfortable. So when a man at 49 or 53 reaches for a patch or starts reading about cholinergic enhancement, or finds himself in another late-night thread about cognitive tools, the honest question, the one the data from Johns Hopkins and Pittsburgh and a 2022 Karolinska paper on stress-dependent cholinergic modulation all converge on, is not whether the substance is safe or effective. It's where the search is coming from. Because there are two very different places it can originate, and they're not equivalent, and the difference between them changes everything about what any intervention will actually do. One origin is curiosity, the open, forward-leaning interest of someone who feels fundamentally okay and wants to understand more, who has cognitive surplus and wants to invest it. That person's neuromodulatory environment is relatively clear. The right tool, introduced into that atmosphere, sharpens something real. The other origin is scarcity. The tight chest, low ceiling experience of a man who has noticed the gap between who he was and who he is now, and who is scanning the environment for something to close it, whose atmosphere is already saturated with chronic anticipatory threat, whose reward system has been rationing signal for long enough that it no longer feels like a choice. That man's dopamine system doesn't need a patch. It needs the condition the patch is trying to compensate for to be addressed somewhere deeper. Because any substance, any real tool, even a genuinely effective one, gets introduced into an environment. And if the environment is one of scarcity and bracing and the low-frequency conviction that the best years are behind you, the biochemical architecture metabolizes even the right tool through that filter. The state you carry in is not separate from the outcome you get. It is part of the mechanism. So the tool this chapter offers is not a protocol. It's a diagnostic question, more accurate than any patch, more specific than any stack. Ask it honestly, without preparing your answer in advance. Is my search for cognitive clarity coming from curiosity and forward momentum, or from bracing, scarcity, and resistance to what I'm afraid is happening to me? There's no answer to hand you. The chapter doesn't know your internal weather. Only you do. But the question, held for even a few minutes without flinching, produces more actionable information than most interventions, because it identifies the environment you'd be introducing any intervention into. The neuromodulatory environment is not something you purchase. It's something you either tend or ignore. And tending it begins not with a supplement, but with the willingness to look at it clearly, to feel the tightening, name it accurately, and refuse to mistake a warning signal for a diagnosis. That refusal, practiced regularly, changes the entire conversation about cognitive health. Not just once, ongoing. As new information keeps arriving, as new tools appear, as the list of moments you're quietly keeping gets longer or shorter, the question stays the same. What state am I in when I want this? A man who carries that question into every new piece of information he encounters is already operating in a different neuromodulatory environment than the one he walked in with. That's not poetic. That's the Pittsburgh finding stated plainly. There's a man, mid-50s, maybe 60, standing in his kitchen at 6 in the morning before the house has started. The window above the sink shows nothing yet, just black glass and his own reflection. He peels the backing off a nicotine patch and presses it to his upper arm. And he holds it there for a few seconds, not from instructions, just from something that feels like intention. The coffee machine is running. The house makes the sound a house makes when everyone in it is still asleep. A radiator tick, a floorboard somewhere settling. He stands at the counter, and he waits. Nobody knows he does this. He's never told anyone. He read about it at 1 in the morning on a forum that links to studies, and then he read the studies. And then he lay in the dark for a while thinking about what he'd understood versus what he'd only believed, and the next morning he ordered the patches. That's where we left him at the end of the last chapter. Not because the compound is the story. It isn't. The compound is the surface. The question underneath, the one the biohacking conversation almost never gets to, is what that moment at the counter actually is. What it's made of. What happens in the body before the nicotine crosses the skin. Before anything external enters the system, there's a man in a kitchen making a deliberate decision in the dark. And that decision has a neurochemical signature that is not nothing. The acetylcholine system we tracked earlier in this video doesn't wait for the molecule. It responds to the state that receives the molecule. The dopaminergic anticipation that fires when a person with agency makes a self-directed choice is measurable. It is not the same event as a person in passive, frightened compliance taking the same compound at the same dose in the same kitchen. The internal field that greets whatever enters is not a backdrop. It is an input as concrete as anything that comes in a box from an online pharmacy. You'll remember the distinction we drew between suppression and decline. A brain running a chronic low-grade threat signal, waking clenched, metabolizing the morning through a narrowed perceptual field, registering the day before it starts as something to be survived. That brain is not the same substrate as a brain that arrives at 6 in the morning with something closer to curiosity. Same age, same cortex, different signal climate, different receptor landscape, different outcome from the same protocol. The research on this is not speculative. It is the kind of thing discussed in labs and clinical offices and certain corners of the literature that haven't been translated yet into anything the mainstream has found useful to say. The man with the patch may be right about the compound. The data may support him more than his critics admit. There is a case that nicotine at low doses at the right developmental window of the aging cholinergic system does something worth taking seriously. We're not dismissing him, but the circles that hold him up as proof that the right molecule, the right dose, the right timing can hold the line against cognitive decline. Those circles are almost entirely silent on the question of what he represents beyond the patch. And that silence is where this conversation has to go, because what it omits is what determines whether any protocol you've ever considered, tried, or abandoned without the results you expected actually had chance. There's a smell to that kitchen at 6 in the morning. Coffee and something faintly metallic from the tap running cold before he switched it to hot, and the particular stillness of a house holding its breath. He pressed the patch to his arm and held it there, and in those few seconds there was something happening that had nothing to do with transdermal absorption. Call it what you want. Agency, attention, the prefrontal signal of a man treating himself as a system worth maintaining. The limbic floor quieted enough by that single act of deliberate self-direction that what came next entered a different room than it would have an hour later, when the day had accumulated and the noise had started and the reactive mode had settled back in. That's not metaphor. That's the architecture. The next chapter is going to follow him out of the kitchen, not to evaluate the supplement stack, to understand what he has built over years that makes 6 in the morning in the dark with no audience the natural place for a decision like this. what that quality of self-regard costs to maintain, what it protects against that no compound addresses directly, and what the research on the aging brain, read carefully and without the optimism layered on top of it, by people who need you to feel good before they sell you something, actually says about the relationship between that internal ground and every outcome you're trying to influence. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, that's worth doing before the next one. Not urgency, just continuity. The person who tracked this argument for the last hour, who followed the thread about receptor plasticity through to what it means for the man in the kitchen, who recognized the difference between a brain that is declining and a brain that is suppressed. That person will want to be here when we follow the thread to where it ends. The button is there. 1 second. And then, the last thing. The man is 52 years old. You met him in the first minutes of this video, standing at a bathroom sink, early light coming through a frosted window, pressing a nicotine patch onto the inside of his left forearm with the deliberate calm of someone who has done his research. He had read the studies. He had watched the conversations online. He believed, sincerely, that he was optimizing something. We left him there, and then we spent the better part of an hour inside the actual machinery, the dopaminergic architecture of a brain past 50, the acetylcholine gradients, the receptor sensitivity that shifts not just with age, but with the chronic emotional weather a person carries through their days. We talked about how the brain at this stage of life is not a degraded version of itself. It is a different instrument entirely, tuned differently, responding differently, requiring different conditions to perform. Now we come back to him, and the question has changed. It was never really about the patch. Here is what we know now that we did not know when we first saw him. The nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, the very receptor the patch was designed to stimulate, does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a biological environment that the man himself has been constructing unconsciously for years. Every morning he woke up tense about the quarterly numbers. Every afternoon he sat in a meeting with his jaw locked and his shoulders raised half an inch without noticing. Every night he scrolled through his phone with a low-frequency alertness that never quite resolved into rest. All of that was not just psychological weather. It was chemistry. It was receptor density. It was the baseline concentration of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex before any molecule arrived to do its work. A 2019 study out of Vanderbilt University examined dopamine synthesis capacity in adults across the adult lifespan and found something that rarely makes it into the biohacking conversation: the ceiling on dopaminergic response. How much the system can actually amplify a signal correlates not primarily with age, but with baseline autonomic state. Participants with chronically elevated sympathetic tone showed blunted D1 receptor responsiveness regardless of the compound being tested. The receptor was there. The pathway was intact. But the system was saturated with background interference, and the signal, whether from supplement, a practice, or a naturally occurring reward, could not land cleanly. The patch on his arm was pharmacologically real. The nicotine was crossing the skin barrier. The acetylcholine cascade was being initiated. But into what? Into a system already running at high idle, already defended, already organized around the expectation that the environment is something to be managed rather than inhabited. There is a concept in signal processing called the noise floor, the level of background interference below which no signal can be reliably detected. Engineers spend enormous effort not just amplifying signals, but lowering it, because a louder signal into a noisier environment produces the same result. Nothing useful gets through. The man's brain had a noise floor problem, not because he was broken, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because decades of a particular relationship with urgency, the kind that the American professional environment rewards, the kind that presents itself as ambition and discipline and being on top of things, had set a baseline that the patch was entering cold. And this is where the molecule becomes philosophically neutral. Nicotine does not know who is wearing it. It does not assess the state of the system it enters. It initiates a cascade, and the cascade unfolds inside whatever environment exists. A quiet environment, parasympathetic, grounded, with dopamine receptors that are not already flooded with stress-induced norepinephrine, responds one way. A defended environment responds another. Same molecule, same dose, same forearm, different field. Somewhere in the house, coffee. Distant, not yet poured. He can probably smell it from where he's standing. What we've been building toward across everything covered in this video is not a verdict on nicotine. The evidence is genuinely mixed, and the conversation is legitimately open. What we've been building toward is a more precise question. What is the internal environment into which any intervention, pharmaceutical, nutritional, behavioral, or contemplative, is being introduced? Because at the level of receptor biology, the baseline electrochemical state of a living system is measurable. It either amplifies or attenuates the signals that enter it, and it is not fixed. This is the thing the biohacking conversation often skips, not out of dishonesty, but because it is harder to sell and harder to measure. The state of the system is itself a variable, not a background constant, not an unfortunate given that you work around with a better stack. A variable, one that responds to input, one that can be shifted. And when it shifts, when a noise floor drops, when the autonomic baseline moves from defended to open, the same molecules, the same practices, the same morning routine produce a genuinely different biological outcome. Not because of belief, because of receptor sensitivity, because of dopamine synthesis capacity, because of the conductance of neural circuits that have been, for years, running at partial capacity inside a field of chronic low-grade tension. So who is the man at the sink? He is standing there with real biochemistry and genuine intention, doing something the research actually supports. He is not wrong to be curious. He is not wrong to take the mechanism seriously. But the most important question about his morning is not whether the patch is on or off. It is what state he is in when he presses it down, what he carried to bed the night before, what his nervous system decided somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning about the safety of the world he was waking up into, whether the environment inside his own biology is prepared to receive what he is offering it, or whether it will process the signal through the same defended architecture that has been quietly limiting every input for longer than he realizes. He smooths the patch down with 2 fingers, checks it once at the edge, reaches for the door. The molecule is neutral. The field it enters is not. That field is where the study results become personal, where the protocol either lands or dissipates. The variable that no patch addresses, that no stack corrects, the ground the man is standing on when he decides, without quite deciding, what kind of morning this is going to be.